Orinda, California, on October 31, 2019, was not prepared for what unfolded inside a rented house on Lucille Way. The city is small, quiet, and residential, with steep hills and streets that usually fall silent early in the evening. Halloween night began like many others. Families finished trick-or-treating. Lights went out. But inside one house rented through Airbnb, a gathering was growing rapidly, shaped by deception, online promotion, and unresolved conflicts that followed people into the space. The home was not rented honestly. Investigators later confirmed that the guest who booked the property told the host they needed temporary shelter from smoke caused by the Kincaid fire burning in Northern California. The renter claimed the group was small and included people with asthma who needed clean air. That story secured the booking. What actually occurred bore no resemblance to that explanation. In the days leading up to Halloween, social media posts advertised a large mansion party. Guests arrived from outside Orinda, including individuals connected to San Francisco and Marin City. As evening turned into night, the crowd inside the house grew into the dozens, with estimates nearing 100 people. Music was loud, alcohol was present, people moved freely between floors. Firearms were also present, though the number and locations were unknown to most attendees. The house, designed for temporary lodging, became an unmanaged event space. There was no security, no supervision, and no clear authority. Tension followed the crowd inside. Shortly before 10:45 p.m., violence erupted. Law enforcement later made clear that the gunfire did not come from outside. The shooting unfolded inside the home, across multiple rooms and levels. Investigators described the scene as a bloodbath. Hundreds of shell casings were found scattered across floors, countertops, and furniture. Gunfire came from the kitchen and an upper floor. Bullets struck walls and ceilings at close range, showing how confined and chaotic the space had become. The shooting was not random. Authorities later concluded the violence involved rival gang members, primarily associated with San Francisco and Marin City. At least 2 of the people who were killed were armed and may have fired weapons during the exchange. Investigative leads indicated the confrontation may have begun after a dispute inside the party, possibly involving an attempted theft of personal property. Other leads examined whether the violence was retaliation for a prior gang-related shooting in San Francisco. What is clear is that existing conflicts entered the house along with the guests. Panic followed immediately. People ran toward exits, pushing through crowded hallways. Some hid in rooms. Others fled through the backyard and scattered into nearby hills and neighboring yards. Calls to 911 flooded dispatch lines as reports of shots fired inside the house came in from partygoers and nearby residents. At that moment, Orinda had only 2 patrol officers on duty. Call logs later revealed both officers were tied up on another call in Oakland when the shooting began. Contra Costa County Sheriff's deputies and officers from neighboring agencies responded as quickly as possible. But by the time law enforcement arrived on Lucille Way, the gunfire had stopped. The house was filled with wounded victims, shell casings, and survivors in shock. 5 people ultimately died from gunshot wounds. The victims were identified as Tion Farley, 22, of Antioch; Omar Taylor, 24, of Pittsburgh; Ramon Hill Jr., 23, of San Francisco and Oakland; Javin County, 29, of Sausalito and Richmond; and Oceana Tompkins, 19, of Vallejo and Hercules, who died later at a hospital from her injuries. Authorities stated that Hill and County were armed at the party and associated with rival gangs, a fact that would later complicate the case. Inside the house, investigators faced a nearly impossible task. The sheer number of people present made witness accounts inconsistent. Many guests fled before police arrived. Others refused to cooperate. Multiple firearms had been discharged, making it difficult to determine who fired which shots and which bullets caused the fatal injuries. Despite extensive forensic work, the evidence did not clearly identify a single shooter or a clear sequence of responsibility. In November 2019, 5 men were arrested on suspicion of murder and conspiracy. LeBron Tyree Wallace, 28, of San Mateo; Jaquez Deshawn Sweeney, 20, of Marin City. Jason D. Isles, 20, of Marin City. Shamron Joshua Mitchell, 30, of Antioch. And Devin Isaiah Williamson, 21, of Vallejo, who was identified as the party's promoter and initially arrested as an accessory. For families of the victims, the arrests brought brief hope. That hope faded when the Contra Costa County District Attorney announced that murder charges would not be filed. Prosecutors stated they could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt who fired the fatal shots, given the presence of multiple armed individuals and the chaotic nature of the shootout. Some suspects were later charged with lesser offenses, including illegal firearm possession. Additional arrests followed, including Domitzo Dones, charged as a felon in possession of a firearm, and Frederick Johnson, charged with firearm possession and child endangerment. As of 2026, no one has been convicted of murder for the 5 deaths. Some individuals connected to the night have since received sentences on unrelated or lesser federal firearm charges. The case remains officially unsolved in terms of murder accountability. Beyond the investigation, the shooting triggered immediate consequences. Airbnb announced sweeping policy changes within days, including banning so-called party houses, expanding reservation screening, increasing enforcement against unauthorized gatherings, and permanently banning the guest who rented the Orinda home. Local officials reviewed short-term rental enforcement and public safety planning, acknowledging how quickly a private residence could become a large, uncontrolled gathering. Yet none of these changes brought closure. Families continue to speak publicly about their loss and frustration. The house on Lucille Way still stands. The street is quiet again, but October 31st, 2019 remains a fixed point in Orinda's history, a night when deception, unchecked crowds, armed conflict, and limited police availability collided inside a space meant for shelter. And now, we turn our focus to the second case. But before we proceed, please help these stories reach a wider audience by simply liking this video and subscribing to my channel. I'd really appreciate the support. Thank you. Elijah Wells was 18 years old when he went to a birthday party on the night of November 2nd, 2025. He was from Akron, close enough to home that the trip did not feel risky or unusual. The party was held at a short-term rental in Bath Township, Ohio, a quiet area better known for routine weekends than late-night emergencies. To Elijah and many others, the gathering felt ordinary. A rented house, music, friends, a night expected to end the way similar nights always had. The house had been listed as a short-term rental, meant for temporary stays, not large public gatherings. Still, the party was promoted on social media, and the crowd grew far beyond what the home was designed to hold. By late evening, cars lined nearby roads. Guests moved freely in and out. Inside, rooms filled wall to wall. Outside, groups gathered in the yard and along the street. No one stood at the door checking numbers. No host was present to set limits. Safety was assumed rather than managed. As the night went on, boundaries quietly disappeared. Invitations lost meaning as guests brought more guests. Many people inside the house did not know each other. Alcohol and pressure filled the same space. With no clear authority, no one felt responsible for stepping in when tension surfaced. What might have ended quickly in a smaller setting blended into the noise. Investigators later said an argument formed during the party. It did not begin as something dramatic. Raised voices. A disagreement. The kind of moment that, under different circumstances, might have ended with someone leaving, but the crowd removed distance. There was nowhere for the tension to fade. As people shifted between rooms and spilled outside, the disagreement followed. Just after midnight, the situation collapsed. Gunfire erupted, cutting through music and conversation without warning. Panic replaced celebration in seconds. People ran in every direction. Some rushed toward the house. Others fled into nearby yards and streets. The rented home stopped being a party space and became an emergency scene. 9 people were shot. Elijah Wells was struck 8 times. As the shots continued, he tried to escape. He ran toward a balcony and jumped, breaking his leg in the fall. Even after reaching the ground, he was critically injured, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds. Emergency responders rushed him and other victims to hospitals across the area. Several victims were treated and later released. Elijah remained in critical condition. For 4 days, his condition hovered between survival and loss. On November 6, 2025, Elijah Wells died from his injuries. His death changed the case from a mass shooting investigation into a homicide. Police secured a scene shaped by disorder. Hundreds of people had attended the party. Witness accounts overlapped and conflicted. Videos captured moments but not full explanations. Detectives relied on ballistic evidence, phone records, and interviews to rebuild the timeline of what happened inside and outside the house. Investigators also examined how the party had been organized and how it grew so large without intervention. In the weeks that followed, arrests were announced. 3 suspects were taken into custody: Derquin Edwards, 18, Jashawn Stewart, 19, and a 16-year-old juvenile. Prosecutors charged Edwards and Stewart with murder related to Elijah Wells's death, along with multiple counts of felonious assault and firearm specifications. The juvenile faced corresponding charges in juvenile court, including delinquency tied to murder. Authorities said the case against the suspects was built through ballistic matches, witness statements, and connections to recovered firearms. Court filings outlined a chain of events that unfolded quickly and without control. The violence was not the result of a long-running feud between known enemies. It emerged from a crowded, unmanaged space where pressure and conflict escalated faster than anyone could contain. What began as a birthday celebration ended with hospital rooms, criminal charges, and a family left without answers. The arrests marked accountability, not closure. The legal process continues, but it cannot restore what was lost. The house still stands. The neighborhood returned to routine, but the outcome of November 2, 2025 remains fixed. As of late January 2026, the legal proceedings against the suspects in the shooting of Elijah Wells are actively moving through the Summit County court system. Coming up next as case number 3, the U.S. Navy trained Jordan Benjamin Burleson to live within structure, rules, and responsibility. At 24 years old, he understood routines, accountability, and the idea that actions carry consequences. When he returned to San Antonio on leave, he stepped out of that structured environment and back into familiarity. He was home. Psychologically, that mattered. Being home lowers defenses. It creates a sense that danger belongs somewhere else. That mindset framed the gathering at a house in the 4600 block of Hawthorne Woods in northwest San Antonio. The property was being used as a short-term rental, and the purpose of the night was clear. According to official reports, the gathering was organized to celebrate a birthday and to film a music video. Inside the house were guests, music, and filming equipment. The atmosphere was social and focused. People were there for a reason, not drifting in randomly. Emotionally, the space felt controlled and intentional. What the gathering lacked was oversight. City records later confirmed the home was operating as an unauthorized short-term rental. There was no on-site host and no clear authority responsible for managing access, crowd size, or safety. Psychologically, this absence is significant. When no one is clearly in charge, responsibility becomes scattered. Each person assumes someone else is handling the risks. Attention turns inward, toward the event itself, and away from the environment around it. Jordan Burleson was not caught up in conflict that night. Official reports state that he stepped outside the rental to get food. There was no documented argument involving him. No confrontation. Emotionally, this was a neutral decision, routine, unremarkable, and unguarded. Psychologically, however, it marked a shift. The moment he left the shared space, he moved from collective safety into individual exposure. What happened next did not unfold through escalation. There was no warning phase. According to investigators, the shooting was a drive-by attack. A vehicle approached along Hawthorne Woods, and a passenger in a silver Dodge Charger fired a rifle from the moving car. Authorities have also stated that a white Dodge Charger may have been involved, either traveling with the silver vehicle or connected to the incident. The use of a rifle fired from a moving vehicle suggests distance, both physical and emotional. The shooter did not engage, speak, or confront. The violence arrived already decided. Multiple rounds were fired. Burleson was struck and collapsed across the street from the rental property. The vehicle or vehicles did not stop. They fled immediately. In seconds, the emotional state of the night collapsed, from confidence to shock, from celebration to silence. A space that had felt familiar and safe became the site of irreversible loss. When officers from the San Antonio Police Department arrived, they encountered two disconnected realities. Outside, a U.S. Navy service member lay mortally wounded. Inside the house, the gathering continued in partial ignorance. Police believed several people connected to the event were still inside the rental. Officers surrounded the home and began a prolonged response to remove occupants safely. Nearby residents were told to remain inside their homes as the scene unfolded. As the immediate crisis passed, investigators began interpreting the broader context of the shooting. Police later stated that the attack appeared to be gang-related, based on evidence recovered during the investigation. This included weapons and drugs found inside the home and the nature of the drive-by shooting itself. Importantly, authorities have not linked Burleson to any gang activity. He was not identified as a participant in criminal conduct, nor as someone involved in a dispute that night. Adding to the uncertainty, a partygoer later suggested the shooting may have been a case of mistaken identity or retaliation. That perception, reported in coverage of the case, has not been confirmed by police. However, it reflects how those present tried to make sense of an act that felt sudden and disconnected. When violence arrives without interaction, people search for explanations, misidentification, external conflicts, or unseen disputes, because randomness is difficult to accept. As the investigation continued, city officials examined the property's compliance with short-term rental regulations. The homeowner, Sonia Valdez-Junfin, was later fined $1,000 and banned from operating short-term rentals at that location for 1 year. These penalties addressed regulatory violations tied to the property's use. They did not resolve the homicide. Burleson's identity continued to shape public understanding of the case. He was a U.S. Navy service member home on leave, someone accustomed to structure and responsibility, killed far from duty on a residential street. The medical examiner's confirmation of his identity brought clarity, but also deepened the sense of loss and unfinished accountability. There are also minor variations in how the incident has been documented publicly. Some reports reference July 31, 2024 as the date of the shooting, while others mention August 7, 2024, often in connection with follow-up reporting or enforcement actions. Law enforcement has treated July 31 as the date of the shooting itself. The differing dates reflect reporting timelines rather than disagreement about when the violence occurred. As weeks turned into months, urgency gave way to endurance. The house returned to quiet. The street resumed routine, but resolution did not arrive. By January 2026, the case remained open and unsolved. San Antonio Crime Stoppers continued to offer a reward of up to $5,000 for information leading to a felony arrest. The message remained steady. Someone knows something. The fourth case unveils in the most unsuspecting way. Here's how everything unfolded. The livestream began as a harmless gesture. A phone camera captured music, movement, and the energy of a party inside a short-term rental. For the people watching on screen, it was a brief window into a night of socializing. For the people inside the house, it felt private enough to share without concern. What no one inside the Airbnb understood was that the livestream quietly removed the boundary between inside and outside. That stream revealed a location. On March 26, 2023, teenagers and young adults gathered at an Airbnb rental in Galveston. The house was booked for a party, a temporary space chosen for convenience and privacy. Guests moved through the rooms freely, music played, phones recorded moments meant to be fleeting. The live stream was not intended to draw attention beyond friends. Instead, it made the gathering visible to someone who should never have known where it was happening. Among those present was Denham Cooper, a 15-year-old student and football player in the Texas City Independent School District. He was part of the group inside the house. He arrived expecting a normal night that would end quietly. Nothing about the setting suggested that the outside world was closing in. Investigators later established that the livestream allowed Darius Geroid Geters to identify the location of the party. At the time, Geters was 19 years old. Prosecutors argued that the broadcast provided awareness that would not have existed otherwise. What felt casual to the guests became actionable information for someone watching from a distance. The house itself remained unchanged. Inside, the party continued. The guests did not know they were being located in real time. The sense of separation held, even as that separation was already gone. The violence did not arrive through the front door. A vehicle moved through the neighborhood. There was no confrontation outside the house. There was no warning from inside. The attack came from the street in the form of a drive-by shooting. Gunfire cut through the night in seconds. The speed of the attack left no room for understanding or escape. Denham Cooper was struck by the gunfire. Emergency responders were called, but his injuries were fatal. At 15 years old, his life ended outside a rental home meant to host a single evening. The live stream ended. Music stopped. The Airbnb shifted instantly from a place of gathering to a crime scene. Police secured the area and began reconstructing what had happened. Witnesses described the vehicle involved. Surveillance footage from nearby locations was reviewed. Digital evidence became central to the investigation. The livestream that had seemed insignificant at the time became a critical piece of context. Attention turned quickly to Darius Geroid Geters. Phone data later presented at trial placed him in the area around the time of the shooting. Text messages introduced by prosecutors indicated awareness of the party and intent connected to people believed to be rivals. The case did not rely on a single detail. It was built through convergence. Another key finding involved the weapon. Investigators determined that Geters used a modified firearm during the drive-by shooting. This detail reinforced the prosecution's argument that the act involved preparation. The modification increased lethality and removed any suggestion that the shooting was impulsive or accidental. Geters was arrested in April 2023 at age 19. From that point forward, the legal process moved slowly. Evidence was reviewed, motions were filed. Denham Cooper's family measured time through court dates rather than seasons. Airbnb remained a silent backdrop, unchanged but permanently marked by what happened outside it. The case eventually moved toward trial. On April 21, 2025, jury selection concluded, and testimony began. Prosecutors laid out the sequence clearly. The party, the live stream, the awareness it created, the drive-by shooting, and the aftermath. Digital records, forensic findings, and witness testimony were presented to establish responsibility. Jurors also heard who Denham Cooper was beyond the moment he was killed. He was identified as a student and football player, a teenager with a future that had not yet unfolded. The courtroom narrative emphasized that the loss was not abstract. It was personal and permanent. On Friday, April 25, 2025, the jury delivered its verdict. Darius Geroid Geters was found guilty of murder. On the same day, he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. By the time of sentencing, he was 21 years old. The verdict marked the formal conclusion of the legal process that began with his arrest 2 years earlier. If you've watched to this point and you've found this video interesting so far, I'd really appreciate it if you take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for your support. We now turn our attention to Case 5. The tragedy in Hamlin County, Tennessee, in early January 2026 was devastating. It was intensely heartbreaking. Just after 12:30 a.m. on January 3, 2026, gunfire erupted at an Airbnb rental on Old Poplar Ridge Road in Hamblin County. A party was underway. Dozens of teenagers were inside and around the home. By the time deputies arrived, 4 teens had been shot. 2 were dead at the scene. 2 others were injured and taken to the hospital, where they were treated and later released. One of the victims was 19-year-old Marcellus Sal Vestal of Morristown. Another teenager also lost their life that night. What had been rented as a temporary place to gather became a crime scene before sunrise. The road, the house, and the night itself would never return to anonymity. Instead of treating this event as a single story with a beginning and an end, the facts place it within a broader structure defined by 3 repeating forces: trust without familiarity, power without accountability, and isolation without interruption. The first force is trust without familiarity. Short-term rentals rely on assumed safety. The house looks like a home, so it is treated like one. In the Hamblin County case, many of the teens who attended the party trusted the setting without knowing the people who controlled it or the conditions under which it was rented. There was no shared history among everyone present, no established norms, no long-term host invested in the behavior inside the walls. The trust existed only because the space resembled safety, not because safety had been earned or enforced. Investigators later confirmed the gathering exceeded what the rental agreement allowed. Some attendees were minors. Alcohol was present. That combination, young people, limited oversight, and a private setting, has appeared in multiple violent incidents tied to short-term rentals. The danger does not begin with intent to harm. It begins with misplaced confidence. The second force is power without accountability. Inside the rental, authority was unclear. Who had the right to tell others to leave? Who had the responsibility to shut the party down when tensions rose? No one held formal control, yet several individuals exercised informal power. According to charging documents, arguments broke out inside the house before shots were fired. When power shifts rapidly in a crowded space, escalation becomes easier and restraint becomes optional. Following the shooting, 18-year-old Adam Perez Jr. was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. 19-year-old Talon Wayne Trevathan was charged as a party to the offense, also facing second-degree murder charges, along with additional counts related to the injuries of the surviving victims. Prosecutors later stated that both played roles in the violence that unfolded. Bonds totaling $600,000 were set. The legal system moved in with precision, but only after authority had completely collapsed inside the house. The third force is isolation without interruption. The rental sat along a rural road, away from constant traffic and routine observation. Neighbors did not have a relationship with the guests. Law enforcement was not nearby. Even with many people present, the environment itself was isolated. When conflict escalated, there was no immediate external interruption to slow it down. This pattern has appeared repeatedly in short-term rental violence. Isolation is not about being alone. It is about delay. Delay in intervention. Delay in consequences. Delay in help arriving. In Hamblin County, by the time deputies were called and reached the scene, the damage was already done. In the days that followed, Airbnb confirmed that the account used to book the property was suspended and that the company was cooperating with law enforcement. These actions mirrored responses after earlier fatal incidents connected to unauthorized parties. Policy reviews, however, cannot reverse what happened inside the home that night. Court records indicate the investigation relied heavily on witness statements, forensic evidence, and digital records. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation assisted local authorities. As of mid-January 2026, the case remained active, with the legal process still unfolding. No trial outcome has yet provided resolution for the families involved. As we go deeper into this video, the tragedy gets more intense. The 6th case starts on April 17, 2022. Easter Sunday began in the early hours of the morning and ended as one of the most consequential mass shootings tied to a short-term rental in Pittsburgh's history. Just before 3 a.m., a single-family home in the East Allegheny neighborhood, booked through Airbnb, became the site of a large, unauthorized house party that spiraled into gunfire. By the time the shooting stopped, 10 people had been shot. 2 of them, both 17 years old, were dead. 8 others survived gunshot wounds. 5 additional people were injured while trying to escape, many by jumping from windows or being crushed in the rush to flee. Long before the shots were fired, several lives were moving forward on separate paths. Teenagers arrived throughout the night, drawn by messages spreading quickly across phones and social media. What began as a gathering of friends expanded rapidly. Each new arrival made the party feel more established, more permanent. Inside the house, rooms filled past capacity. Hallways narrowed. Exits became harder to reach. For many guests, the crowd itself created reassurance. The sheer number of people made danger feel unlikely. Outside the house, neighbors experienced the same night differently. Cars lined the street. Music vibrated through walls. Voices echoed across yards. Neighbors perceived the gathering as a routine late-night disturbance. Police visited the address for a noise complaint approximately 90 minutes before the shooting occurred. Officers spoke with someone at the entrance and then left, believing the issue had been addressed. At that moment, the gathering appeared manageable. There was no indication of what was coming next. Elsewhere across Pittsburgh, parents slept. Phones were silent. Easter plans waited for morning. There was no warning that some families would soon be rushing to hospitals, while others would receive news that would divide their lives into before and after. Inside the rental, the absence of oversight mattered. Investigators later estimated that more than 200 people were packed into the house at the time of the shooting. The gathering violated both the property's rules and Airbnb's global ban on parties. There was no host present, no security, no one checking who entered or what they carried. The house functioned as an open space without boundaries, relying entirely on trust among strangers. Shortly before 3 a.m., those parallel lives collided. Gunfire erupted inside the house and spilled outside. ShotSpotter technology later detected more than 90 rounds fired, indicating sustained gunfire and multiple shooters. Music stopped instantly. Panic replaced celebration. People surged toward doors that could not handle the volume. Some fell. Others climbed through windows and jumped to escape. When the shooting ended, the damage was clear. 10 people had been shot. 2 did not survive. Jaden Brown, a 17-year-old senior at Woodland Hills High School, was weeks away from turning 18 and graduating. Matthew Steffi Ross, a 17-year-old from Pitcairn, was also just weeks from graduation. Their lives ended inside a house never meant to hold hundreds of people. 8 others survived gunshot wounds. 5 more were injured while fleeing. Some suffered broken bones after jumping from second-story windows. Others were hurt in the crush of bodies trying to escape. Survival did not mean returning to normal. It meant hospital rooms, surgeries, rehabilitation, and trauma that extended far beyond that night. Outside, neighbors stepped into chaos. Sirens filled the street. Police lights flashed against nearby homes. Injured people scattered across sidewalks and yards. What had started as noise had become a mass casualty response in a residential neighborhood. Police returned to a scene defined by scale and confusion. The number of people involved made securing the area difficult. Witnesses were scattered and shaken. Shell casings were found in multiple locations. Identifying shooters proved complex in a crowd that large, especially after people fled in all directions. The investigation stretched on, shaped by the conditions created by overcrowding and rapid dispersal. In the aftermath, accountability became the central question. Airbnb confirmed that the party violated its policies and permanently banned the individual who booked the rental. The company stated it would pursue legal action. At the same time, survivors and families of the victims turned to the courts. Several civil lawsuits were filed against the property owners and Airbnb. Adia Brown, Jaden Brown's mother, filed a wrongful death claim as the representative of her son's estate. Tyrial Neal, a guest who was shot in the leg and suffered a shattered femur and dislocated hip, filed a negligence lawsuit in July 2022. Dejonia Rosser, who broke her leg and sustained other injuries after jumping from a second-story window to escape, filed suit in November 2022. As of January 2026, those lawsuits remain active in Pennsylvania courts. Airbnb has argued in filings as recently as late 2025 that it cannot be held liable for unforeseeable criminal acts committed by third parties. Families and survivors have argued that enforcement gaps, lack of safeguards, and platform practices contributed to the conditions that allowed the party to grow unchecked. The cases remain unresolved. The impact of April 17, 2022 did not end in courtrooms. By January 2026, the shooting continued to influence city policy. After another shooting occurred at a different Northside short-term rental, Pittsburgh City Council introduced new legislation aimed at stricter regulation of these properties. The proposed measures require annual licensing, clear enforcement authority, and mandatory local contact information so police and city officials can quickly reach a responsible party when rentals become disruptive or unsafe. As we advance into the seventh case, more than 30 shell casings were scattered across the floors and surrounding areas of a short-term rental house on Lincoln Street when police entered the scene. Before any names were released, before any arrests were announced, that detail alone told investigators this was not a single gunshot, not a brief confrontation, and not a momentary loss of control. It was sustained gunfire inside a confined space, fired rapidly enough to overwhelm everyone inside. The shell casings became the first, clearest signal of how severe the violence had been. The house was being used as a short-term rental, listed as an Airbnb, in the Elmwood Park neighborhood of Columbia, South Carolina. It was not a permanent home for anyone involved. It was a temporary space, occupied for one night by teenagers and young adults who did not live there and were not rooted in the neighborhood. That lack of permanence mattered. Temporary spaces often carry fewer social boundaries and fewer expectations of accountability, especially in the early morning hours. Just after 5:15 a.m. on June 6, 2025, the first 911 call reached Columbia Police. The call did not initially report a shooting. It came in as a possible vehicle break-in nearby. That detail remains important because it shows how unclear the situation was in real time. As officers were responding, dispatchers received updated information. The call changed. Gunfire was now being reported inside the Lincoln Street house. By the time officers arrived, the violence had already unfolded. Inside the home, police found 4 teenagers suffering from gunshot wounds. The shell casings, more than 30 of them, were spread across multiple areas of the residence, indicating repeated shots fired in quick succession. Investigators later said the number of casings suggested sustained firing and raised the possibility that more than one firearm had been used. Among the victims was 18-year-old Jaden Cavan Brackens. He had suffered critical injuries. Despite medical efforts, he later died from those wounds. 3 other teenagers, 2 18-year-olds and 1 17-year-old, were rushed to area hospitals. Authorities later confirmed that the surviving victims were in stable condition. As investigators began piecing together what led to such extreme violence, they focused on who had been present and how the situation escalated so quickly. Police stated that the individuals involved were loosely acquainted. This was not a random home invasion by strangers. Access already existed. Familiarity, even limited familiarity, meant that barriers were already lowered before the first shot was fired. The ages of everyone involved became impossible to ignore. These were teenagers, not adults with years of shared history or entrenched disputes. The gathering reflected that reality. Young people awake before sunrise in a borrowed house, when fatigue dulls judgment and emotions can outweigh restraint. Investigators would later emphasize that the timing and setting played a role in how rapidly the situation spiraled into violence. Within hours of the shooting, police announced the first arrest. A 15-year-old male was taken into custody on June 6. Because of his age, his name was not released publicly. Authorities stated that he faced multiple violent charges connected to the shooting. At that point, police stressed that the investigation was still active and that additional suspects were being sought. On June 7, 2025, a second arrest followed. Latrell D. Huey, who was 18 years old, was taken into custody and charged with murder, armed robbery, and multiple counts of assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature. With two suspects now in custody, investigators confirmed they believed the shooting involved more than one participant. The physical evidence collected at the scene had already pointed in that direction. As the weeks turned into months, that assessment proved accurate. In late November 2025, police announced a third major arrest. A 17-year-old male suspect was taken into custody in Atlanta, Georgia, and extradited to Colombia. Prosecutors charged him with murder, criminal conspiracy, 3 counts of assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature, and possession of a firearm by a minor. Because of his age, he was placed in the custody of the South Carolina Department of Juvenile Justice, where he remains held. Investigators stated that this arrest reflected evidence of coordinated actions, not just during the shooting, but in the events surrounding it. The case was no longer defined by a single moment of violence, but by a sequence of decisions involving multiple people. Authorities also arrested 18-year-old Asaya Bellamy, charging her as an accessory after the fact. According to police, her charge was based on actions taken after the shooting occurred, rather than participation in the gunfire itself. While public details about her alleged role have remained limited, the charge reinforced investigators' position that responsibility extended beyond the moment shots were fired. As of when this video was uploaded, the investigation remains active. 3 primary suspects are in custody: Huey, the 15-year-old male arrested shortly after the incident, and the 17-year-old extradited from Atlanta, all remain held as their cases move through the legal system. Prosecutors have emphasized that evidence continues to be reviewed and that proceedings are ongoing. Case 8 unveils with a heartbreaking encounter, the type no parent would ever want to experience. Jaqual Dayton Allen was 19 years old when he entered a short-term apartment in Arlington on the night of November 23, 2024. He was not yet 20, but he was only hours away from that milestone. His birthday would have arrived the next day. The stay was not accidental or spontaneous. Police later confirmed that Alexis Janya Tyler made the reservation for him, booking the apartment specifically as a birthday gift. It was meant to be a moment of celebration, a pause before a new year of life began. Alexis Tyler was there because she wanted to mark that moment with him. Investigators would later reveal a detail that added another layer to the loss. Alexis was pregnant at the time of the shooting. That fact did not become public immediately, but when it did, it changed how the case was understood. The apartment was not only holding a birthday plan, it was holding futures that had not yet had a chance to unfold. What happened that night did not begin inside those walls. According to official police reports and court records, tension had been building well before the rental was booked. Investigators believe the conflict centered on money involving Dayton Allen and people he knew. This was not an argument that formed that evening. It was ongoing. One specific issue documented in court filings involved Diamond Curdy's car being returned without gasoline. By itself, the detail sounds small. Police emphasized it not because it was severe, but because it illustrated how resentment had been allowed to accumulate rather than settle. It was one of several unresolved points that kept the dispute alive. That slow build is key to understanding the case. Financial disputes often appear manageable until they are not. They rarely announce when they are about to turn dangerous. They sit quietly, creating pressure without visible confrontation. To the people involved, they feel uncomfortable but survivable. To everyone else, they are invisible. On the evening of November 23rd, the apartment complex looked ordinary. Cars came and went. There was no visible disturbance. Nothing about the setting suggested that a private conflict had found its way inside. This is where hindsight can be misleading. At the time, there were no clear warning signs that would have stood out to a passerby. Surveillance footage later reviewed by investigators showed several individuals arriving at the complex together. They did not appear confused or lost. They moved with familiarity. They wore hoodies. At least one carried a heavy bag. In real time, these details meant nothing. Hoodies are common, bags are common. Only after the shooting did detectives recognize these movements as coordinated rather than coincidental. One fact quickly shaped the direction of the investigation. There were no signs of forced entry. Doors were intact. Windows were unbroken. Police later clarified why this mattered. The suspects were known to the victims, and some were even guests. Access was not forced. It was granted through familiarity. The threat did not come from outside their lives. It came from within their circle. Inside the apartment, the reason for gathering had not changed. This was the start of a birthday celebration. Police have not described a prolonged argument or a chaotic escalation inside the unit. There is no public record of shouting or confusion spiraling out of control. What investigators have consistently stated is that the violence was targeted, not accidental. Gunfire ended the night. When officers arrived, they found Jaqual Dayton Allen had been shot inside the apartment. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Alexis Jania Tyler was still alive when first responders reached her. She was transported to a hospital, where she died less than an hour later. In the immediate aftermath, investigators focused on what was missing rather than what was damaged. No forced entry, no random intrusion. Those absences narrowed the scope quickly. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was not a stranger acting without direction. It was violence connected to people who already knew where Allen and Tyler were staying. Publicly, the days that followed were quiet. There were no immediate arrests. Detectives collected surveillance footage from the apartment complex and surrounding streets. They tracked vehicle movements. They examined phone location data. They compared timelines minute by minute. The goal was not speed, it was certainty. As evidence accumulated, patterns began to form. Investigators saw suspects arriving together and leaving together. Movement appeared coordinated rather than scattered. That suggested planning rather than panic. During the investigation, firearms were recovered. Early reporting referenced concerns about possible modifications, but official police releases in June 2025 clarified that the recovered weapons were still undergoing further forensic testing to determine whether they could be definitively linked to the crime scene. That clarification mattered. It showed the investigation was cautious, careful not to overstate conclusions before testing was complete. Months passed as evidence was layered piece by piece. The warning signs that had existed before the shooting, financial tension, familiarity, access, were now visible, but only because the outcome had already occurred. At the time, those same signs blended into ordinary life. In June 2025, Arlington Police Department announced a major development. 5 individuals were arrested and charged with capital murder in connection with the deaths of Jaqual Dayton Allen and Alexis Jania Tyler. Among those charged was Diamond Curdy, whose name appeared repeatedly in court records tied to the financial dispute. The decision to pursue capital murder charges reflected how prosecutors viewed the case. This was not treated as a single impulsive act by one person. It was treated as a group action involving shared presence, shared movement, and shared responsibility. Police cited surveillance footage, digital location data, and investigative findings to support the charges. Authorities emphasized that the motive they uncovered was not abstract. It involved money, perceived disrespect, and unresolved obligations. The dispute over the car being returned without gasoline was cited not because it alone caused the violence, but because it showed how tension had been allowed to build instead of being addressed. The next murder case, which is the 9th case, sets in motion on December 13, 2022, where a property on Illinois Street, New York, was being used as a short-term rental through Airbnb, booked for a gathering connected to the filming of a music video. Guests arrived expecting a private indoor setting where the night would remain contained. Equipment was brought inside, music played, people moved freely through the rooms. The house was being used as a temporary venue, not as a home. What followed did not begin there. According to findings later confirmed by the Rochester Police Department, a dispute involving a stolen illegal firearm was already active before anyone entered the rental. That conflict did not originate on Illinois Street. It traveled with the individuals involved. The short-term rental did not create the problem, but it provided a space where the dispute could surface without interruption. As the evening continued, the number of people inside the house increased. Alcohol was present. Conversations overlapped. The gathering grew beyond what the street's residents expected for a weeknight in a residential neighborhood. There was no host on site. There was no immediate authority to intervene once conditions began to shift. The environment changed gradually, not suddenly. Control weakened without a clear moment where the situation stopped being manageable. At some point during the night, a group entered the house looking for a specific individual they believed had taken the firearm. Investigators later confirmed this confrontation was intentional. It was not a spontaneous argument between strangers. It was a targeted encounter brought into the rental from outside. The house became the place where an existing dispute reached its endpoint. Voices were raised. The atmosphere changed. The music that once filled the space no longer mattered. The presence of firearms inside the home turned the situation irreversible. Gunfire erupted. Multiple shots were fired in rapid succession. 5 people were struck by bullets. Panic followed immediately. Some guests ran from the house. Others collapsed where they stood. Neighbors heard the gunshots and called emergency services. When Rochester police officers arrived, they found 5 victims suffering from gunshot wounds. 4 were transported to nearby hospitals with serious injuries. One victim, 24-year-old Joaquim Douglas, had been fatally wounded. The house was sealed off as an active crime scene. Police tape replaced filming equipment. Evidence markers were placed across rooms that had been filled with people minutes earlier. Investigators worked through the night, collecting shell casings, documenting damage, and interviewing witnesses. Authorities confirmed publicly that the shooting occurred inside a short-term rental on Illinois Street. The confirmation shifted attention beyond the immediate violence. This was not a commercial venue or a known event space. It was a rented home on a residential street. Neighbors described shock that such a large gathering had taken place inside the house at all. The setting became central to how the case was understood. Police later clarified that the violence stemmed directly from the dispute over the stolen firearm. The shooting was not random. It was not a robbery gone wrong. It was targeted violence brought into a private space that lacked safeguards once tensions escalated. Firearms had been introduced into the house. Once shots were fired, there was no opportunity to prevent what followed. The investigation continued long after the night ended. Detectives reviewed surveillance footage, phone records, and witness statements. Movements before and after the shooting were traced. 2 primary individuals were identified as responsible for firing weapons inside the house. In August 2025, nearly 3 years after the shooting, both defendants entered guilty pleas. Martin Gibson admitted responsibility for the fatal shooting of Joaquim Douglas. Devontae Lippens admitted to a weapons offense connected to the same incident, acknowledging his role in firing during the attack. Final sentencing concluded in October 2025. On October 16, 2025, Martin Gibson, age 33, was sentenced to 15 years in prison, followed by 5 years of post-release supervision. He pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter, formally accepting responsibility for Douglas's death. 4 days later, on October 20, 2025, Devontae Lippens, age 32, was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison after pleading guilty to second-degree criminal possession of a weapon. Prosecutors stated that Lippens had fired at another victim during the incident. With those sentences imposed, the central criminal proceedings reached their end. Both men are currently serving their prison terms in New York State custody. According to prior statements from the Rochester Police Department, no further murder charges are expected in connection with the Illinois Street shooting. However, authorities have also indicated that the investigation remains open in a limited capacity, allowing for additional arrests if new evidence emerges, particularly related to weapons offenses or individuals who may have assisted before or after the shooting. Moving to the 10th murder case on the list. The Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety responded to the area. Neighbors on the 1400 block of Navarro Drive had been calling in noise complaints as the night grew louder and more crowded. Cars lined the street, music spilled from the house. From the outside, it looked like another out-of-control party, the kind that might eventually calm down or get shut down. Inside, the gathering continued without interruption. The home was being used as a short-term rental listed on Airbnb, even though city officials later confirmed it was not registered with the city of Sunnyvale as required by local rules. The homeowner was not present. Without consent from the owner or an immediate legal basis to force entry, officers were initially unable to go inside. From the street, police could hear the noise and see the crowd, but enforcement stalled. Inside the house, nothing paused. Guests kept arriving, music continued, the party expanded. The gathering had not started with visible danger. Early arrivals described a typical house party atmosphere, but invitations spread rapidly on social media, drawing people far beyond the original guest list. By late evening on August 7, 2021, police estimated the crowd had grown to 150 to 200 people, many of them teenagers. The house was never designed to hold that many bodies. Rooms filled, hallways tightened, personal space disappeared. As numbers increased, control thinned. There was no host enforcing limits, no one checking who came in or out. Alcohol circulated freely. People who did not know each other stood inches apart. Conversations overlapped. Minor disagreements surfaced and dissolved without resolution. No single moment announced that the situation was changing. It happened quietly, as density and pressure increased. Among those inside the house was 18-year-old Elias Elhania. Also present was a 17-year-old, later identified by investigators as the suspected shooter. According to the report, Elias did not know the suspect. They were not connected by friendship or prior conflict. Their interaction formed only because both were present in the same overcrowded space. Any dispute between them unfolded within minutes, not over time. The police presence outside did not register inside the house. Music stayed loud. Guests continued moving from room to room. The absence of immediate enforcement allowed the gathering to carry on as if nothing were at risk. Inside, tension did not arrive with warnings. There was no clear argument that stopped the party. No moment when people collectively sensed danger. The environment itself was doing the work, crowding strangers together, shortening patience, removing space for misunderstandings to cool. When gunfire erupted, it came without notice. No buildup cleared the room. One moment blended into the next, and suddenly shots cut through the noise. Panic replaced music. People ran in different directions, unsure where the threat was or how to escape. The shooter fled into the confusion, disappearing as guests scattered. Once officers entered the home, they found two people suffering from gunshot wounds. Elias Elhania was pronounced dead. Another person was injured and later taken to a hospital, where they were expected to survive. The house that had been packed minutes earlier emptied quickly. Many witnesses were already gone, making the scene difficult to reconstruct in real time. Investigators began piecing together what had happened through interviews, physical evidence, and social media posts advertising the party. The Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety later confirmed that the shooting stemmed from a dispute during the gathering, not a random attack. The suspect, a juvenile, was later arrested. The violence was not the result of a long-running feud. It emerged from a brief interaction made possible by the conditions inside the house. As the investigation continued, attention shifted to the setting itself. City officials confirmed the property violated Sunnyvale's short-term rental regulations. It was not registered. It was not approved for large gatherings. The party itself was unauthorized. Airbnb later removed the listing from its platform, stating the event violated its global ban on large parties, a policy already in place in 2021. As we launch into Case 11, the suspect was already gone. By the time police understood a murder had taken place, the man they believed responsible was no longer in the United Kingdom, moving beyond borders while investigators were still piecing together what had happened inside a quiet townhouse in West London. The case began not with an arrest, but with absence, an empty trail, a closed door, and days of lost time that would shape everything that followed. That absence centered on the killing of Kamanan Thiamphanete, also known as Angela. She had been staying alone at a short-term holiday rental on Stanhope Place in Bayswater, a Grade 2 listed townhouse that once served as the Ethiopian embassy. According to reports clarified in 2025, the suspect had allegedly agreed to a high-value rental deal worth around £30,000, with the stay beginning on April 5, 2024. The arrangement suggested stability and intention, not a fleeting visit. Nothing about the booking signaled danger. What investigators later told an inquest sharply revised the timeline. Although Kamanan's body was discovered on April 8, detectives believe she was actually killed on April 6, approximately 2 days earlier. The formal cause of death was confirmed as sharp force trauma resulting from multiple stab injuries. For nearly 48 hours, she is believed to have been dead inside the property, while life outside continued normally. Concern only surfaced on the evening of April 7th. Friends who had been unable to contact her called police at 7:05 p.m., requesting a welfare check. The call was assessed and graded as medium risk. Officers did not force entry. When friends called again at 9:34 p.m., repeating their concern and stressing that the silence was unusual, the grading remained the same. No immediate attendance followed. Experts in police response explained that welfare checks are triaged based on perceived immediacy of harm. Without confirmed threats, injuries, or distress signals, officers are often constrained by policy. But those same experts note that context matters. Sudden loss of contact involving someone isolated in a temporary rental carries different risks than silence in a shared or supervised setting. It was not until roughly 13 hours after the second call that officers forced entry into the Stanhope Place townhouse. Inside, they found Kamanan Thiamphanete dead. By then, the estimated time of death meant she had likely already been dead for close to 2 days. The delay did more than limit life-saving options. It also erased the narrow window in which a suspect might still have been in the country. Once the body was discovered, investigators moved quickly on one conclusion. The suspect was no longer present. Travel records showed he had left the United Kingdom shortly after the killing. With that confirmation, the investigation shifted immediately from a local homicide to an international manhunt. Alerts were issued. Partner agencies abroad were notified. The case expanded beyond London almost overnight. At this transition, expert analysis helps explain why short-term rental cases escalate so fast. These properties are built around speed and discretion. Access is digital. Identity checks are remote. Departures are expected. When violence occurs inside such spaces, detection often lags behind reality. That lag creates opportunity. Investigators believe that opportunity was deliberately extended. Police have said the suspect may have used a holiday rental app to impersonate a legitimate tenant. More significantly, they believe messages were sent from Kamanan's account to her boyfriend after she had already been killed. Those messages created the impression she was alive, delaying alarm and reducing urgency during the most critical period. Digital forensics experts note that this tactic is increasingly common. It does not require technical sophistication, only access. In an age where presence is measured by messages and read receipts, a person can appear alive long after they are gone. In Kamanan's case, that illusion may have cost days. As the manhunt continued through 2024, scrutiny also turned inward. Because of the delay between the welfare calls and the forced entry, the Metropolitan Police formally referred themselves to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, The IOPC review was launched to examine whether the risk grading and response decisions were appropriate given the circumstances. Oversight specialists stress that such referrals are designed to examine systems rather than assign instant blame. The focus is on whether policies adequately reflect modern living arrangements, where isolation, short-term accommodation, and digital communication can mask danger until it is too late. In early 2025, the investigation reached a critical shift. Authorities confirmed that the international manhunt had been called off. The reason was not an arrest in the UK, nor the filing of murder charges abroad. Instead, police said the suspect had been detained overseas for unrelated criminal matters. Because he was already in custody, active pursuit efforts were suspended. This change marked a move from pursuit to legal process. Legal analysts emphasized that detention abroad does not equal justice. The suspect was not being held for Kamanan's killing. Any prosecution related to her death would depend on extradition, charging decisions, and international cooperation. Reports from 2025 and 2026 highlight extradition as the central obstacle. If the suspect is being held in a country without an extradition treaty with the United Kingdom, such as China or Hong Kong, there may be no direct legal path to bring him to trial. Experts have warned that in such cases, families can face waits measured in years or even decades, with no guarantee of resolution. As of 2026, those details have also not been formally disclosed to Kamanan's family. Legal experts explain that secrecy may be maintained to protect ongoing proceedings or parallel investigations, but for families, it can feel like another door closed. The 12th case on the list involves Juliana Panunzio and Christine Crooks. They entered a rented house in Fort Erie, Ontario, expecting nothing more than a birthday night among familiar faces. The date was January 19, 2021. The home sat along the Niagara Parkway, booked as a short-term rental for a single evening. It was borrowed space, clean, furnished, temporary. A place meant to hold laughter for a few hours before everyone returned to their real lives. What unfolded inside that house shows how quickly a shared environment can shape decisions, movement, and loss. Juliana Panunzio was 20 years old. Christine Crooks was 18. Both were guests at the gathering. Music filled the living room. People moved freely between rooms. The house functioned as many rentals do: open, flexible, lightly supervised. There was no permanent owner present, no staff, no one tasked with enforcing boundaries. That absence created a quiet shift in responsibility. People assumed someone else was paying attention. As the night progressed, more individuals entered the house. Some were expected, others were not. Court testimony later showed that the gathering grew beyond its original plan. In a permanent home, unfamiliar faces might stand out. In a rented space, they blend in. The environment made it easy to arrive and difficult to track who belonged there. Doors opened. Hallways carried sound, but not focus. The layout mattered. The living room became the central point, drawing people inward. The hallway connected private and shared spaces, turning movement into overlap. Bedrooms and bathrooms offered brief separation, but no true distance from what was happening elsewhere in the house. The structure encouraged closeness without clarity. Tension entered quietly. There was no clear signal that danger was approaching, no moment when the room fell silent. The space allowed friction to grow unnoticed, carried from one area to another without interruption. People were close enough to hear noise, but not close enough to intervene. The house did not stop escalation, it allowed it to move. Gunfire erupted while the gathering was still underway. Evidence presented in court showed that Christine Crooks was shot in the hallway and bathroom area. That narrow passage, designed for privacy, became a point of sudden danger. Juliana Panunzio was shot multiple times while seated in a chair in the living room, the most open space in the house. The contrast between those locations matters. One young woman was struck while moving through a confined area. The other was struck while sitting, exposed, in a shared room meant for conversation and celebration. Panic followed instantly. Sound echoed through walls not built to contain it. People ran without understanding where the threat was coming from. The same open design that welcomed guests now made escape chaotic. Doorways were not meant for crowds. Hallways narrowed movement. The environment amplified confusion at the exact moment clarity was needed most. Emergency responders arrived, but Juliana Panunzio and Christine Crooks died at the scene. The house was sealed and treated as evidence. A space designed for short stays became a permanent marker of loss. Furniture placement, room layout, and bullet trajectories were documented. The environment itself became part of the case record. Investigators focused on those who had been inside the rental. Witness statements varied. Some guests fled immediately. Others remained. In crowded, informal settings, memory fractures easily. Who was in which room? Who saw what? Who arrived last? These gaps became critical. The setting complicated recollection because no one had been tracking the night in real time. Police identified Christopher Lucas as the shooter. At the time of the murders in 2021, Lucas was reportedly under house arrest and on probation for unrelated matters. That detail added another layer to the case. Restrictions meant to limit risk failed to prevent access to the gathering or the weapon. The system existed on paper, but not inside the rented house. As the legal process unfolded, more context emerged. A woman connected to the rental later pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice for providing false information to investigators. That decision reflected the confusion and fear that often follow violence in shared spaces. When responsibility feels divided, truth can be delayed. The trial centered on evidence rather than emotion. Jurors heard about the sequence of shots, the positions of the victims, and the movement of people inside the house. They learned how the layout shaped visibility and response. They were asked to consider not only what happened, but where it happened, and how that environment influenced outcomes. In January 2026, Christopher Lucas was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. Under Canadian law, that conviction carries an automatic life sentence. The jury recommended that Lucas serve 25 years before becoming eligible for parole. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crime and the structured limits of the legal system. Accountability was formalized, but loss remained unchanged. Now to the final case. 7:20 a.m. on January 8, 2020. Inside a short-term rental on Gilmore Street in Ottawa, a sequence of events unfolded that would leave more unanswered space than resolution. The house, booked through Airbnb, was quiet at that hour. Within minutes, gunfire cut through the interior. By approximately 7:30 a.m., emergency calls reached police and paramedics. When first responders arrived, 18-year-old Manyok Akol, known locally as FTG Metro, was already dead. 3 other young people had been shot. What followed was not a clean ending, but an aftermath defined by what was gone and what never arrived. The first absence was immediate. Manyok Akol did not wake up that morning. Court evidence later established that he was asleep in a bedroom when he was shot. There was no argument, no confrontation, and no warning. He did not see the person who killed him. The violence entered quietly, moved quickly, and ended his life without a single exchange. What remained in that room was silence, forensic markers, and a future that would never unfold. Emergency responders moved through the house with urgency. Paramedics triaged the survivors and rushed them to hospital with serious gunshot wounds. They lived, but survival did not restore what the morning took from them. Their injuries marked the start of long recoveries, physical, psychological, and emotional. Each carried away a different kind of absence. Safety without conditions, sleep without fear, rooms that did not feel watched. When investigators from the Ottawa Police Service secured the scene, the character of the location came into focus. This was not a social gathering that slipped out of control. Evidence showed the Airbnb was being used to facilitate drug transactions. Police recovered fentanyl, cocaine, and loaded handguns from inside the house. The property's temporary nature mattered. It offered anonymity and minimal oversight, features that made it useful and dangerous. What remained after police left was the knowledge that the house had been used as an instrument, not a home. The attack itself was brief and deliberate. Court testimony established that 14 rounds were fired in less than 2 minutes. The handgun was equipped with a suppressor, significantly reducing the sound of the shots. Prosecutors later described it as the weapon of an assassin, emphasizing intention rather than impulse. The gunman entered, fired rapidly, and left. There was no prolonged chaos, no chase. The person who carried out the shooting vanished almost as quickly as the violence began. That disappearance became central to the case. Months later, police charged a 15-year-old with first-degree murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. Early public assumptions often placed this teenager as the shooter. Court proceedings corrected that understanding. Prosecutors established that the accused did not pull the trigger. He was described as the inside guy, the person who provided access to the Airbnb and shared information with the gunman. He knew who was inside. He knew when the house was vulnerable. He enabled the attack without executing it. As of May 2024, the individual who fired the weapon has not been identified or charged. This absence defines the aftermath. One person faced charges for facilitating the crime. The person who killed Manyok Akol remains unnamed. The case does not settle into symmetry because the central actor is missing from accountability. For Manyok Akol's family, the loss is not theoretical. At 18, he was just beginning adulthood. Music was not incidental, it was his focus. Under the name FTG Metro, he had been recording, releasing tracks, and building recognition within Ottawa's local rap scene. His path forward was still open, untested, and his own. That openness ended in a bedroom inside a rented house. What remained were unfinished songs, halted plans, and a family forced to measure time by who was no longer present. The Ottawa music community felt that absence in smaller, cumulative ways. A young voice stopped contributing. Studio sessions that never happened. Performances that never arrived. His name shifted from expectation to memory, not through ceremony, but through silence. Over time, the absence settled in. The 3 survivors carry a different residue. Survival did not restore what the morning removed. Being shot inside a house at dawn reshapes how a person experiences quiet, doors, and sleep. Their lives did not return to baseline. The absence they carry is harder to name, but persistent. The house on Gilmore Street did not retain memory. After the investigation concluded, the property returned to ordinary use. Listings changed. New occupants arrived with no connection to what had happened inside. The space absorbed nothing. The lack of markers made the violence easier to overlook, but it did not undo it. The house moved on. The people did not. The legal process unfolded within the constraints of youth justice law. Details remained limited. Proceedings moved forward without spectacle. There was no final statement from the shooter, no public account of motive from the person who fired the gun. Instead, the record settled into partial truths: how access was granted, how the attack unfolded, and a silence where a complete explanation should have been. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to my channel.